Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, there's a specific kind of arrogance we tend to have, I think, as native English speakers.
How so?
Well, we sort of implicitly assume that to truly master this language, I mean, to really bend it, to break it, to write prose that actually haunts people 100 years later, you have to be born into it.
Right.
You have to absorb the nursery rhymes, the slang, the rhythm of the streets, right from the cradle.
It is a fair assumption, though. I mean, literature, maybe more than any other art form, it usually relies on that deep subconscious, almost biological connection to your mother tongue. It's about intuition.
Exactly. And that is why the subject of today's deep dive is such a monumental, just a complete head-scratching paradox. We are tackling a figure who is widely regarded, I mean universally regarded really, as one of the greatest stylists in the history of the English language. We're talking about a guy who fundamentally changed how modern novels are written.
A writer who sits right in the pantheon, alongside Shakespeare and Dickens.
Right. But here is the hook. And this is the data point that honestly just baffled me when I started reading through the stack of research you sent over.
Okay.
This man didn't speak a word of English fluently until he was in his 20s.
And even when he did learn it, he never lost his accent. To the very end of his life, if you met him at a dinner party in Kent, he spoke with this thick, heavy, almost unintelligible foreign intonation. He would butcher the pronunciation of words he had written perfectly on the page.
We are talking, of course, about Joseph Conrad, and the central mystery we are going to try to unravel today is pretty specific. How does a Polish nobleman born in the Russian Empire, who spent his wild youth gun-running in the French merchant marine, end up becoming the absolute master of English prose?
It's the ultimate imposter syndrome success story, but it's much darker than that. It's really a story about trauma, exile, and reinvention.
It really is. And the data points we have here, they aren't just biographical trivia, they are the ingredients of a worldview. We're going to look at how a childhood defined by political exile, a suicidal youth in Marseille, and a truce horrific stint in the Congo created a philosophy that feels, well, surprisingly modern.
Conrad actually had a term for this internal state. He called himself homo duplex.
The double man.
The double man, which I know it sounds like a comic book villain, but it's actually a really profound psychological diagnosis he gave himself.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What did he mean by homo duplex?
It refers to the constant tension between his two identities. On one side, you have his Polish identity, which was tied to the land, to the nobility, to this whole history of oppression and martyrdom. On the other side, you have his English identity, which was tied to the sea, to commerce, to the sort of practicalities of being a sailor. And that duality, that tension, is the key to unlocking everything he ever wrote.
So our mission today is to explore that tension. We're going to trace the line from the red faction of Polish revolutionaries to the red ensign of the British Merchant Navy.
Right.
And we have to start where the duality begins, Section 1, the tragic origins. Because Joseph Conrad is a mask, isn't it? Who was the person behind it?
He was born Józef Teodor Konrad Korzeniowski in 1857. And we need to be really specific about the geography here because it explains this massive chip he had on his shoulder. He was born in Berdichev.
Which is in modern-day Ukraine.
Correct. But at the time, strictly speaking, it was part of the Russian Empire. However, culturally, his family was deeply, fiercely Polish. You have to remember, Poland literally did not exist on the map at this time.
Right, it had been partitioned.
Exactly. Carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the late 18th century. But the Korzeniowski family belonged to the Szlachta.
Okay, so define that for us. Is that just standard aristocracy?
It's more specific than that. The Szlachta were the nobility, yes, and they made up about 10% of the population. But they viewed themselves as the custodians of the Polish soul, while the state itself was dead. They had a coat of arms, the Nakzhov, but, they weren't sitting around counting gold. By the time Conrad was born, many of them, including his family, were land poor, but incredibly rich in ideology.
So he's born into this noble class that has lost its country. And his father, Apollo Korzeniowski, he seems like the archetype of this tragic nobility. He wasn't just a dad, he was a radical.
Oh, Apollo's a fascinating figure in his own right. He was a writer and a translator. He actually translated Shakespeare and Victor Hugo into Polish, which is where Conrad got his early literary taste. But primarily, Apollo was a fierce political agitator. He was part of what was known as the Red Faction.
The Red Faction. I'm guessing this isn't about communism, given the time period?
No. This predates the Bolshevik use of the term. In 1860s Poland, the Reds were the hardliners. They were fighting for immediate, total independence from Russia. They wanted the restoration of Poland's pre-partition borders, land reform, the abolition of serfdom. They were the insurgents.
And this isn't just background noise for Conrad, right? This activism, it basically destroyed his childhood.
Completely. In 1861, his father was arrested for organizing resistance in Warsaw, and the Russian authorities, well, they didn't take kindly to sedition. The family was sentenced to exile. And we're not talking about a comfortable house arrest in a country manor.
They were sent to Vologda. I looked this up on a map. It's like 500 kilometers north of Moscow.
It is a brutal, freezing climate. It's the gulag before the gulag existed.
Yeah.
For a family used to the temperate plains of Ukraine, it was a death sentence. And the tragedy here is just absolute.
Yeah.
The conditions were so harsh that Conrad's mother, Iwa, contracted tuberculosis. She died when Conrad was only 7 years old.
7 years old. That is a formative trauma that you don't get over that.
And it gets worse. His father, Apollo, tried to raise him alone in this exile. Oh. Just picture this. Yeah. A grieving, radical intellectual, homeschooling his young son in a freezing Russian shack, introducing him to these great tragic writers, all while he himself is dying of the same disease that killed his wife.
Oh, man.
Apollo passed away when Conrad was 11.
So by age 11, he's an orphan. But he's not just an orphan, he's the son of political martyrs.
Exactly. And this is the first crucial insight for you, the listener. If you want to understand why Conrad's books are so gloomy, why he is so deeply skeptical of political idealism, you have to look at this boy. He watched his parents sacrifice everything for a noble cause, Polish independence, and the result was zero. They died, the uprising failed, and he was left alone in the cold.
It sort of invalidates the concept of heroism before he even hits puberty.
It instilled a deep, marrow-level distrust of grand causes. He saw that idealism leads to martyrdom, and martyrdom just leaves a child alone in a room with a corpse. That's the emotional baseline for Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim. He learned early on that the universe does not reward good intentions.
So he's taken in by his maternal uncle, Tadeusz Bobrowski, and this uncle seems like the complete anti-Apollo.
He was the pragmatist. He was the sane one. He loved the boy, but he looked at him and just saw a mess. Conrad was sickly. He was nervous. He was prone to what they called attacks. He was not a good student. He was constantly reading novels instead of doing his Latin homework.
And the medical advice of the 19th century kicks in here.
Right. The boy needs fresh air. The doctors basically told the uncle to toughen him up with physical labor. And Uncle Bobrowski thought, well, maybe he can become a sailor come businessman, get him out of the suffocating atmosphere of occupied Poland.
Which leads to the jump to the sea. This is section 2 of our outline. And I think a lot of people probably imagine Conrad joining the rigid, disciplined British Navy right away. But that's not what happened at all.
No, the first step was much more chaotic. In 1874, at 16, he leaves Poland for Marseille to join the French Merchant Marine. And this period, frankly, it just sounds like a movie. It wasn't disciplined, it was bohemian.
It sounds like a gap year gone wrong.
It was exactly that. He's a teenager with a monthly stipend from his uncle living in France. He falls in with the artistic crowd. He spends way too much money on clothes and theater. And inevitably, he gets involved in contraband.
Gun running.
Gun running for the Carlist cause in Spain. These were ultra-conservative Catholic monarchists fighting a civil war. Again, notice the pattern. Conrad is drawn to these lost, romantic, violent causes. He's smuggling weapons on a little boat called the Tremolino.
But it all comes crashing down in 1878. This seems to be the pivot point of his life, the moment where he almost didn't become Joseph Conrad.
It's his convergence of disasters. First, he gambles away his entire allowance in Monte Carlo.
A classic move.
Second, and this is the bureaucratic nightmare, the Russian officials refused to renew his permit to sail on French ships.
Why would they do that?
Because technically, he was still a subject of the Tsar. He was liable for military service in the Russian army. The French couldn't legally employ him without that Russian paperwork, so his career was dead. He's in debt, he can't work, and he's facing the prospect of being dragged back to Russia to serve the empire that killed his parents.
So he tries to check out.
He does. In March 1878, he invites a creditor to tea, to establish an alibi, and then he shoots himself in the chest with a revolver.
This is the part that usually gets scrubbed from the high school bios. We like to think of him as this stoic sea captain, not a desperate 20-year-old with a gambling problem.
It disrupts the narrative, but it's absolutely true. The bullet missed his heart, miraculously. And here is where Uncle Bobrowski becomes the MVP. He rushed from Ukraine to Marseille, and he covered the whole thing up. He told everyone Conrad had been wounded in a duel.
Because in the code of the nobility, a duel is honorable, but suicide is a scandal.
Precisely. A duel implies you were fighting for honor. Suicide implies despair and cowardice. But this near-death experience, it forced a change. He couldn't stay in France. He needed a merchant marine that didn't care about Russian permits. And in 1878, the only major fleet that had loose enough regulations was the British Merchant Navy.
That is such a fascinating detail. He didn't join the British Navy because he loved tea and the Queen. He joined because it was the only place that would take him.
Necessity drove him to the Red Ensign. He stepped onto British soil in Lowestoft knowing almost no English. He learned the language not in a classroom, but on the decks of coal ships, from rough sailors, reading newspapers, listening to orders.
Which brings us to the linguistic miracle. This is the part of the story that writers just obsess over. Conrad was trilingual: Polish, French, English.
And French was his second language. He spoke it perfectly. He was culturally French in many ways during his youth. He could have written in French. In fact, logically, it would have been much easier for him.
So why didn't he? Why struggle with English?
Well, there's a famous debate about this. Later in life, Conrad claimed English was the speech of his secret choice, that it felt natural to him. But he also gave a technical reason that I think is just brilliant. He said French was too crystallized.
Crystallized, meaning what, rigid?
Yes. French has the Académie Française. It has these strict rules about syntax and vocabulary. It is a highly polished, defined instrument. Conrad felt he couldn't play with it. It was already finished. But English, he called English plastic.
It's messy.
It's a total mongrel language. It steals from German, Latin, French, Hindi. It has a massive vocabulary with all these subtle shades of meaning. Conrad felt he could mold English to his will in a way he couldn't with French. He could force it to do things it wasn't supposed to do.
But did that actually work? Because when his books came out, critics noticed something was off.
Oh, yeah. Rudyard Kipling, who was his contemporary, famously said that reading Conrad was like reading an excellent translation.
Ouch, that feels like a backhanded compliment.
It sounds like an insult, but it's actually a really profound observation. Conrad's writing is full of what linguists call Gallicisms, sentence structures that are essentially French and Polonisms. He would do things like put the adjective after the noun, like a man tall instead of a tall man.
Right.
Or he would use these nested clauses that spiral on, which is very common in Slavic languages, rare in English.
But the argument here is that this foreignness is actually his superpower.
It is. Because he wasn't a native speaker, he couldn't use cliches. A native speaker says, "It was raining cats and dogs," without even thinking. It means nothing. Conrad had to consciously construct every single image. He had to weigh every word. It gave his writing this strange, hypnotic rhythm that forces the reader to pay attention. He describes things a native speaker would just gloss over.
It's like seeing your own house through the eyes of a stranger for the first time. You notice all the cracks in the paint that you usually ignore.
Exactly. It allowed him a level of detachment. He could analyze the English character in the British Empire from the outside, even while he was writing in their language. He was inside the machine, but he wasn't of the machine.
So he spends 20 years at sea. He works his way up from steward all the way to captain. He commands a ship called the Otago. He isn't a writer who dabbles in sailing. He's a professional master mariner.
And he writes in the margins of his life. He starts his first novel, Almayer's Folly, in 1889. He carries the manuscript around the world in his sea chest. It almost gets lost in a railway station in Berlin. It almost gets dropped overboard in the Congo.
And speaking of the Congo, we have to go there. This is section 4, The Heart of Darkness.
This is the defining trauma of his adult life. In 1890, Conrad takes a job with a Belgian company to captain a steamship up the Congo River.
Okay, context is key here. This is the era of King Leopold II's Congo Free State.
Which was a total euphemism for a private slave plantation. It wasn't a colony in the normal sense. It was the personal property of the King of Belgium. Leopold was extracting rubber and ivory, and he was doing it through a system of forced labor, mutilation, and terror that killed millions of people.
Did Conrad know what he was walking into?
Not entirely. He had some of these romantic Victorian ideas about exploration and civilizing missions. He wanted to see the blank spaces on the map, but what he found when he arrived just shocked him to his core. He called it the scramble for loot.
He saw the mask slip.
He saw European men who claimed to be the pinnacle of civilization acting with absolute savagery. He saw the complete breakdown of moral order. And physically, it just destroyed him. He was only there for about 6 months, but he came back with malaria, dysentery, and gout.
He said later that before the Congo, he was a perfect animal, but afterwards, he was a ruined man.
But that ruin produced Heart of Darkness. The novella is essentially a retelling of his journey. Marlowe is Conrad. Kurtz is the embodiment of the corruption he saw. It's a book that questions the very idea of progress.
But we can't talk about Heart of Darkness in 2026 without addressing the elephant in the room, the Achebe debate.
This is crucial. For decades, Conrad was taught as this hero of anti-colonialism. But in 1975, the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe gave a lecture that changed how we read Conrad forever. He called Conrad a thoroughgoing racist.
That is a heavy charge. What was the core of his argument? Because the book does seem to criticize the white colonizers.
Achebe argued that Conrad dehumanizes the African characters to make his point. If you read the text really closely, the Africans are rarely given dialogue. They're described as limbs, eyeballs, shapes, or shadows. They don't have names. Achebe's point was that Conrad uses Africa merely as a backdrop, a stage prop, for the breakup of a European mind.
So the suffering of the African people is just set dressing for the white guy's existential crisis.
Exactly. Achebe argued that by denying them language and agency, Conrad was perpetuating the very racism he claimed to be critiquing. He said Conrad was a bloody racist because he couldn't conceive of Africans as fully human equals.
Is there a defense against that? Or is the book just, canceled?
There is a defense, and it's a heated scholarly battleground. The defense is that Conrad was a man of 1899, and for his time, he was radical. He was exposing the lie of the white man's mission. He was showing that the savage wasn't the African, but the European exploiter.
And we have to remember his own background here.
Right, the homo duplex. Conrad knew what it was like to be a subject. His people, the Poles, were the Africans of the Russian Empire, in a sense, conquered, occupied, silenced. So he had an instinctive sympathy for the oppressed, even if his language reflects the prejudices of the Victorian era.
It's messy. It's complicated.
Which is why the book is still discussed. If it were just a racist diatribe, we'd ignore it. If it were just a simple anti-colonial pamphlet, we'd forget it. It's the tension, the fact that it is both critical of empire and trapped by imperial thinking, that keeps it alive.
So he comes out of the Congo, his health is ruined, and he retires from the sea to write full-time. And he brings this very specific philosophy with him. You sent me a letter he wrote to his friend Cunningham Graham in 1897, and honestly, it is one of the bleakest things I have ever read.
The knitting machine letter. This is essential, Conrad.
Walk us through.
Because he isn't just saying life is hard, he's building an entire cosmology. Conrad is arguing against the idea that the universe has any moral purpose. He says, there is let us say, a machine. It evolved itself out of a chaos of scraps of iron, and behold, it knits.
It knits.
He writes, I am horrified at the horrible work and stand appalled. And the most withering thought is that the infamous thing has made itself without thought, without conscience, without foresight. It knits us in and it knits us out.
It knits us in and it knits us out. That is terrifying.
It's the ultimate expression of indifference. He's saying the universe isn't hostile. It's just mechanical. It knits space, time, pain, death, and despair. And it doesn't care about you. It doesn't even know you exist.
This explains his politics, too, then. He wasn't a Democrat. He wasn't a liberal.
Not at all. He distrusted democracy because he thought it was just a tool for demagogues to manipulate the masses. And he didn't believe in international fraternity or the brotherhood of man.
Why? That seems so cynical.
Because he looked at Poland. Poland was screaming for help for a century, and the brotherhood of nations did nothing. He believed the only thing that binds us together is our shared suffering and our shared ignorance. We're all just victims of the machine.
With a worldview that dark, you'd think his personal life would be a complete disaster. You imagine him just sitting in a dark room drinking absinthe. But then we have this pivot to his marriage.
This is the domestic surprise. He marries Jessie George. She was a working-class Englishwoman, 16 years younger than him. She wasn't an intellectual. She wasn't a writer. She was a typist.
His friends were baffled.
They were. H.G. Wells and Henry James, they couldn't understand what on earth they talked about at dinner. But Jessie provided the one thing Conrad desperately needed: stability. She was an incredible cook. She actually wrote a cookbook later in life. A friend called her the mattress for Conrad's nerves.
That's a slightly patronizing compliment.
It is, but it captures the dynamic. Conrad was a physical wreck. He had gout, he had depression, and he had a bizarre phobia of dentists.
This was in the notes. He wouldn't go to the dentist.
He was terrified of them. He would let his teeth rot until they absolutely had to be pulled out. He once joked that every novel cost him a tooth. So you have this man in constant pain, agonizing over every sentence, screaming about the knitting machine, and Jessie is there making a roast and keeping the world at bay. She was his anchor.
And the work he produced in that house. Let's talk about the style. We've mentioned the translation feel, but he's often called a literary impressionist. What does that mean for the listener who hasn't taken a lit theory class?
Think about an impressionist painting, like a Monet. It's not about photorealism. It isn't a crisp photograph. It's about the light, the fog, the feeling of a moment. It's a blur that creates a mood. Conrad wanted to do that with words.
He has that famous quote, "My task is to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see."
Right. He doesn't just tell you the ship was sinking. He bombards you with sensory details. The slant of the deck, the scream of the metal, the smell of the panic, the specific way the light is hitting the water. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia said Conrad's prose rang like a tenor bell. It resonates. It suggests things that can't quite be said directly.
He wants you to hallucinate the scene.
Exactly. He wants to bypass your intellect and hit your nervous system directly.
And he grounded this high art in hard facts. He claimed he didn't keep a notebook, but that's a lie, right?
Or he had a photographic memory. Almost all of his major novels are based on real scandals he heard about at sea. He was a gossip in the best possible way.
Okay, give us an example of how he turned news into art.
Take Lord Jim. It's the story of a young officer who abandons a ship full of pilgrims because he thinks it's sinking. But the ship doesn't sink. It's towed into port, and the officer is disgraced for life.
That actually happened.
Oh, yeah. It's the real story of the SS Jeddah in 1880. It was a massive scandal in the maritime world. Conrad took that headline and turned it into this profound psychological study of guilt and redemption.
And The Secret Agent, which is about a terrorist plot in London.
Based on the Greenwich Observatory bombing of 1894, a real anarchist blew himself up in the park. Conrad took that gritty, stupid reality and turned it into a dark satire about terrorism, police incompetence, and the sheer absurdity of politics.
This is why he is still so relevant. We are still dealing with terrorism, with incompetence, with guilt. We're still dealing with the dark side of globalization, and pop culture is still mining his work, often without people even realizing it.
Constantly. You see it in high literature. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Le Carré.
Yeah.
They all mimicked his style, but you see it in movies, too.
Not pileups now.
The big one. Francis Ford Coppola took Heart of Darkness and just dropped it into the Vietnam War. Marlon Brando is Kurtz. The river is the Mekong instead of the Congo. But the themes, the journey upriver into madness, the question of who is the real savage, it is pure Conrad.
It just shows how adaptable the story is. You can move it to space, you can move it to Vietnam.
In fact, the movie Alien has touches of Conrad. The ship is called the Nostromo, which is the title of one of Conrad's biggest political novels. Ridley Scott is a huge fan.
And I saw a video game in the notes, Spec Ops. The line.
Yes. It's a military shooter that came out a few years ago. It starts like a generic Call of Duty game, but as you go deeper into the city of Dubai, the morality just disintegrates. You end up doing horrific things. It is a direct structural homage to Heart of Darkness. It forces the player to realize that they might be the villain.
That is the Conrad touch. He doesn't let you stay a spectator. He implicates you.
Exactly. He pulls you into the knitting machine.
So we have the Homo duplex, the Polish noble turned British captain, the man who saw the world as a mechanism of indifference. How did it end?
There is a final irony that just perfectly sums up his entire life. In 1924, nearing the end, he was offered a British knighthood.
Sir Joseph Conrad.
And he declined it.
Really? Why?
Because deep down, he was still a Korzeniowski. He was Polish nobility. He had his own coat of arms, the Narus. He felt that taking a knighthood from the British Empire would be a betrayal of his ancestors, or perhaps just redundant. He didn't need a new title. He kept that distance to the very end.
And when he died?
He died later that year, 1924. He's buried in Canterbury. But if you go to his grave, you'll see they actually misspelled his name.
No way.
It says Tedor instead of Teodor. Even in death, he was a bit of a stranger, a foreigner, an error in the system.
So what is the takeaway here? We've covered a lot of ground today.
I think the takeaway is that Conrad wasn't just a writer of sea stories for boys. That's how he was pigeonholed for a long time. But he was actually a witness. He saw the globalized world before globalization was even a word. He saw the cracks in the empire. And he brought this outsider perspective, this deep skepticism of a persecuted Pole, right into the heart of English literature.
He dragged the chain and ball of his personality to the end.
He did. And he showed us that civilization is fragile. That darkness isn't something that happens in far-off jungles. It's something we carry with us inside.
Which brings me to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We live in an age of absolute data. We think if we have enough information, we can solve anything. We think we understand how the world works. But Conrad suggests that the only indisputable truth is our ignorance.
We are just scraps of iron in the knitting machine.
On that cheerful note, thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. Go pick up The Secret Agent or Lord Jim. It's dense, it's tough, but it is worth the effort.
Absolutely.
See you next time.